Thank you for staying with us. France has a solid footprint on the African continent, which has been maintained over the years through economic, political, and cultural ties with all its former colonies. However, writing for Arab News, Khaled Abou Zahr is of the view that in recent times, France relations in Africa have been strained. The setback in Niger, he believes, jeopardizes the country's entire positioning in West Africa. Unfortunately for French President Emmanuel Macron, Khaled suggests that Niger is not the only place where France is facing failure. Khaled's position reflects a growing consensus that change is afoot in Africa. Without question, emerging trends, along with fresh challenges on the continent, pose a serious threat to France's influence and status as a major trade and investment partner on the continent. President Macron has been working overtime, some would say, to address this. In 2017, he told African youths in Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou, that he is of a new generation of French leaders who would build partnerships with the continent rather than tell it what to do. He advocated a new approach based on reciprocity and stronger connections with civil societies. He reiterated that sentiment in a speech earlier this year, I think either late February or early March, when he visited Central Africa. What is fact is that France hosts the largest African diaspora in Europe, and 14% of French immigrants live in Africa. Africa is home to the largest number of French speakers in the world. A relationship is inevitable. It is the evolving nature of that relationship that we will seek to consider in the second half of the program. My guest is Mr. Ovigwe Egwegu, policy analyst, development reimagined, Istanbul, Turkey. It's good to have you on one slot. I can't hear you. If you can unmute.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thank you for agreeing to share your time and expertise with us. There's been changes, no doubt, in the dynamics of relationships across the globe, but how would you describe the current state of France's political and economic engagement with African countries?
Yes, for some time now, of course, there's been this trend of what have been described as anti-French sentiment in many parts of Africa, particularly countries in West Africa and Central Africa. So it is, but it's being characterized as some form of decolonization process, actually, because we are aware that when African countries got their independence, the process of decolonization was different depending on who the colonial government was. For the British, it was almost 100% clear that the political independence came largely with economic independence as well. But for countries that were colonized by France, it was very different. I remember the case of Guinea, for instance, when Guinea tried to pull out of the CFA, which is a French monetary system. The French actually printed counterfeits of the Guinean currency to actually destroy the economy. So they've really tried in many ways to maintain that control, or what is being called new imperialistic control over its economies. And for decades, leaders after leaders in this part of Africa, particularly in Western Africa or the Sahel, have really been trying to continue the decolonization process, particularly in the economic domain. But if we fast forward to the early 2000s, the early 2010, when we saw an uprising in Mali that almost broke the Malian state, the French came in with Operation Serval then, and they really tried to provide security and guarantees and backing to the Malian state. That was a success, and the operation that followed that was Barkhane, which was meant to then work with West African countries to counter terrorism in Sahel and other transnational crimes. But that was completely a failure until the Malians came and kicked them. The Malian coup happened with Assimi Goïta, and then kicked out the French, then Burkina Faso as well, and we're seeing that in Niger.
Give or take, Macron, I mean, in recent times, in recent memory, Macron has been making an effort to address the legacy of its colonial past in Africa. There's been a lot of agitation for this if we are to reevaluate the nature of the relationship that is for both continents. Macron has made overtures. Some have described it as a start. How has this overtures over the years, in your impression, impacted that relationship?
Well, it has been more words than action, in the sense that when we're looking at so-called new colonial structure, new imperialist structure, particularly in this former French colonies, I think the easy target is the monetary policy. Because, for instance, as a government, if you don't have sovereignty over fiscal policy and all of that, then you can't really plan your economy. So, even if there's the argument that was made that African countries should pull out of the CFA, and some are saying it provides some form of macroeconomic stability and taming inflation, but that is just one indices to look at of several. If you compare Cote d'Ivoire, for instance, and Ghana, one country might have more stability, but poverty in one is largely more than the other. So Macron heard all of these complaints, and when he came into office, he promised to make changes. Actually, they did make some changes to the CFA monetary system. He did try to give more allowance to African countries to partake in the security domain. Also, you will recall there is the G5 Sahel force that comprises Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and the idea was to have these countries take some form of control, both in the monetary space and security domain. But it really is not enough. We're saying decolonization. You shouldn't be the one dictating the terms. It's the countries that are decolonizing that should be dictating the terms. And if they don't want the French to be present, whether in the security space or have their revenue stored in France, then it's their prerogative, because at the end of the day, it's their country, and these countries are supposed to be sovereign.
But whether we like it or not, you know that we need, we should have a relationship of some sort, bilateral, for business, communication, economics, or however you look at it. Would you say that African leaders are actually taking the initiative, defining the relationship that they want at this moment?
Well, some leaders are actually good at talking. Meanwhile, some are actually good at acting. If you look at, for instance, in countries, the countries where we've seen coup very recently, there's been a lot of hyping of the trend as it were, and a lot of promise. They're saying the nice words, but let's be very mindful. We've seen these type of rhetorics in the past, and it doesn't really translate to action. However, in some cases, there have been very clear actions, and those actions have already are indicative that actions are matching the words. And Mali is a good example. They've had a constitutional referendum organized by the military government, and that constitutional referendum has addressed very key issues, particularly the issue of northern Mali, and created two autonomous administrative provinces, semi-autonomous rather, administrative provinces that will be, so not semi-autonomous, but those new provinces will be led by people from that region, and they will have to vote in the elections to govern themselves a little bit more. There's also the removal of French as an official language from the country. They've also looked also at the mining code and ensure that the state has 10% stake in mining contracts, with the option for extra 20%, depending on how the mine operation evolves. Because these are very poor states, and they've been told over years they don't need to bother with investment, but at the same time they are growing poorer and poorer. The state has no capacity. So these changes, for instance, are seen as a way of both decolonization, but also trying to steer the economy in the right direction. But in other places, that has not really been the case. It's just been lots of words and niceties.
You agree that some efforts it has been expended. What, in your view, are some of the key factors that is driving the changing dynamics in Africa's relationship with France, and is this a good thing?
Whether it's a good thing, I think it will depend on how African countries and the leaders taking over actually use the opportunity that they have. I'll give you again another example from Burkina Faso. When Roch Macabore, who is the last elected president of Burkina Faso, took office, Burkina Faso was not even in the news on terrorism at all. And if you fast forward until the coup of 2022 February that was done by Damiba, removed Roch Macabore from office. At that point in time, Burkina Faso has lost 40% of its territory to terrorists. Now, Burkina Faso was in French-led G5 Sahel. Burkina Faso was supportive of French military operation in the Sahel. They hosted French special forces in Burkina Faso. They were working closely with the European training missions. But in that same period, you've lost 40% of your territory, not GDP. So if that trend had continued, probably there will be no Burkina Faso state today. If you're a Burkinabe citizen, you are going to ask your government or your people, why are we losing our country while we're supposedly in this international partnership of security with France or whoever, and nothing is, it's not just that you're not making progress, you're actually losing your country. So when you see people celebrate on the streets of Ouagadougou or Mali, that or asking for the French to withdraw, is because they cannot measure substantively what that president has done positively in terms of national security.
Well, I think I'm still going to stay with that. The influence that France, his influence on the fight against terrorism. I want to ask you, how is this influencing our changing relationship, and what can we do to create some sort of balance? Because we seem to rely on them for military assistance and the likes.
Yes, but the military assistance has not really provided tangible benefits on the ground compared to how much they were spending. Operation Barkhane, for instance, was about $1 billion a year. That is really huge. If you invest $500 million each into Burkina Faso and Mali, like you give the government, or you pump that into an economic project, I'm sure you are going to win more terrorists back to being normal citizens than using that in a military operation. And that is because fundamentally, the key drivers of these security challenges is the poor economics and the poor governance. And that is a point that needs to be emphasized over and over again. The security problems in the Sahel, to a large extent, have economic solutions, not necessarily military solutions, or at least military component is minimal compared to the economic situation, right? So when you look at the agitation against France, it is actually coming from the economic perspective. The belief that the French has not allowed these countries to prosper because of the new colonial chokehold. Yes, the people are correct in a sense, but we also have to forget that these countries are led by Africans. And the leaders who have led these countries in the past decades have been very abysmal. They've not done the work that they're supposed to do. So we can, to a large extent, I think people tend to scapegoat France, and not enough criticism of the leaders, of people who have run the affairs of these countries.
Okay, let's see if we can look at another angle to this conversation. How has France's relationship with Africa been influenced by competition from other global powers? For instance, there is the rise of China as an influential player in Africa, and it has had a significant impact on global dynamics. How is France responding to China's growing presence on the continent?
Yes, even the current wave of anti-French sentiment, as it's been described, has been blamed on, for instance, disinformation or Russian misinformation. It's Russia that is, stoking all of this. That is not just largely overblown. It is actually very insulting if one considers the history, of these countries and then their colonial relationship with France. But with China, I think for many African countries, China represents economic opportunity, and in the security domain, maybe not so much. Not so many look to China for key partnership, but I think opportunities are there. And for them, they will need to focus primarily on creating enough stability, to attract those investments. The French, in their calculation, do not necessarily consider China to be a threat specifically to their interests in African countries. However, in the broader scheme of things, in NATO, for instance, they've of course declared China to be a strategic competitor, a systemic rival globally, right? But specifically saying that the Chinese are responsible for anti-French sentiments in West Africa or other parts of Africa, I think there is no evidence for that. Neither have I read any accusation in that direction.
Okay, looking to the future, what do you see? Let's take your crystal ball now. The relationship between France and Africa looking like?
Yeah, I think we're actually in another pivotal moment. The only comparable era to what we are seeing now is the independence era, because this is a complete and total collapse of French-Africa relations or French-Africa influence. And the question is, how are these countries going to move forward? I think, first of all, they have to set two priorities. One of them is to ensure that the internal political issues are addressed, and the country has a dynamic to actually turn a new page. That's why whenever you see these coups, the first thing they want to do is to organize constitutional referendum, because fundamentally some of their problems are not policy, they are constitutional. And if they can follow due process and consult with their people to understand what the genuine needs are from a political perspective, from a democratic perspective and governance perspective, I think then they will create a very good platform to attract investments from all over the world, possibly even back from France, and see ways they can move their country forward. The world is changing. African countries, I think at this point, see themselves to be more active players rather than passive, and the idea that they should be passive and just be dictated to, I think that era is really coming to an end.
Active player will take any day. We hope to see more activeness in our relationship with other parts of the world. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us. We appreciate your insights on the program.
Anything.
And that's where we wrap things up in one slot tonight. Thank you for your time. We hope to see you next time. Stay with us.